Now, I had skipped ahead chronologically in this story to show you why the rest of the New World failed, why the rest of the New World tried to create American style classical liberalism, why it tried to create inclusive institutions, and yet it just couldn't do it. That it would be a long and bloody and vicious struggle for it to approach liberal democracy as we know in this country. But now we're going to bring it back to the source. What made America different? What allowed America, of all places, to escape the vicious cycle, to forge a new sort of society that would end up being an inspiration to people around the world, whether in Europe, like the French and the 48ers, or in Latin America, like Bolivar? And the answer, more or less, is that this country was a clean slate on which to write a new society. Now, we all know that the land was not empty. It belonged to whatever Indian tribe currently happened to inhabit it. Keep in mind that these people are constantly fighting each other over territory, just like the Europeans do. But their population densities are much lower. When the Virginia colonists, the first of the Americas, were as big of a deal as we make out of Thanksgiving, don't forget Virginia is older than Massachusetts. When the Virginia colonists come to Jamestown, their hope is to find a giant Mexico somewhere in the interior. They're not looking to make a utopia. They're not like the Puritans. They're not like the Quakers. They just want to get rich. But the problem is there is no giant Indian empire in the interior. All there are hunter-gatherers and early Neolithic farmers who know no state, know no king. They are not going to stay put. They're not going to take orders from anyone. It's often thought, and you will have a homework question about it, or a reading assignment about it. But it's thought that these Indians might have actually played a large role in inspiring the development of Republican institutions here. The Virginians are going to try to introduce titles of nobility. They're going to try to introduce serfdom, but they're not going to be able to make it stick. Any white man that comes to the colonies, he might serve his full term as an indentured servant, but if he doesn't like it enough, he's going to pack his bags and move further down the road because there's a whole continent full of land that'll take him. The Indians, even if they can catch one, they'll just run off into the woods again. The only population that's suitable for imposing this kind of parasitical master and slave, lord and serf kind of structure on are going to be the slaves they buy from Africa, because they have nowhere to run to and they stick out like a sore thumb if they run away. And yet, even in the most slavery intensive parts of the country, there's still going to be a minority. I think it peaks around in South Carolina and Georgia. I believe they were a majority at points. But in most of the South and the North too, because the North is also practicing slavery on a fairly large scale in those days, in most parts of the South, even though it's a slave society, most people are not slave owners, and most people are not slaves. Your average Southerner is what's called a yeoman farmer, a pioneer, a man who owns his own land and works his own land. The Jeffersonian ideal. This kind of world isn't intentionally created by the founding fathers. If anything, it's the opposite, in that the founding fathers of the original colonies wanted to recreate a world of privilege like they had in Europe. But in order to get anyone to agree to come here and to stay put, they had to bargain with them. They had to offer them a better deal. In the North, there's going to be an ideological basis for opposing the creation of a caste system. New England is founded by Calvinist extremists. Pennsylvania is founded by Anabaptist extremists. And frankly, if you're going to live around one or the other, you would much rather live around the Anabaptists. That'd be your Amish, Mennonites, Quakers. They're gentle people. They're hippies. They're Christian hippies. But one thing that both of those places can agree on is that every member of the community is supposed to be at least an equal before the eyes of the law. While the English Civil War was raging back in England, they were still getting the news over here. There were even battles of the English Civil War fought on American soil. And the Puritans, they're rooting for Cromwell. There was a very solid basis from which to build a Republican society. And the first representative government in the New World is going to be Virginia's House of Burgesses. These colonies will vary to the extent that they're more democratic or more oligarchic. They'll vary to the extent that they're more capitalistic or more traditional. But the one thing they all have in common is that nobody runs around calling themselves Sir So-and-so, issuing orders to other people. Because they can't. Because in a country this big and empty, if they tried to pull that crap, they'd either get gunned down or they'd get laughed at and folks would just move further into the woods. And so, just like with Argentina, just like with Australia and Canada and all of those other sort of edges of the earth where Europeans settled on their own, they end up creating a much more egalitarian society. And there's also going to be a much more egalitarian distribution of property. Not because there's somebody redistributing the wealth, not because somebody is taking away from someone to give to someone else, but because there's new land that, once conquered from the Indians, can be taken freely by the settlers. Now, the second big point is America's Revolution was also a huge success because it wasn't really a revolution in the first place. Revolution implies some kind of dramatic reorganization of society. It implies that some kind of monumentous change has happened that has reshaped everything. That's an accurate term for describing what happened in France when their caste system crumbled. And it's an accurate description of what happened in Russia when their capitalist system was replaced with 100% government control. But in America, the American Revolution didn't really free the country from some state of tyranny. It's more that it restored it to a state of freedom that it had already had before the British came in to interfere with it. See, when these colonies were founded, they were founded with the king's approval, but the British government didn't run the show. I compared it to franchising way back in the corporations lecture. They were given the king's blessing, to go and set up a new little England, but they were also allowed to make tweaks to it. It's their party. England is more than happy to indulge this because it means they get to get rid of dissidents. They don't have to put up with filthy Calvinists and Anabaptists and Catholics and all sorts of different kinds of rabble rousers. They don't have to put up with weird ethnic minorities like Irishmen. Yes. They can get them to move somewhere else. In a sense, it's a way for England to, in a more, gentle way, a less murderous way, ethnically cleanse itself. These colonies are going to be self-governing. They all have Republican governments at the start. They might have a constitutional monarch way far across the sea that they technically own fealty to, and they're very proud of him, and they like to put paintings of him up on their tavern walls. But the king isn't really issuing laws. The king's not taxing them. Parliament just kind of leaves them alone. They're not even really being protected by them either. Whenever war breaks out, it's mostly the colonies fending for themselves against the French and the Indians. In reality, they were only colonies on paper. The truth was that these were new nations from the moment they were set up, and they already had their own national identities at the same time. Older than the Union, but also distinct from the old country. It was when Britain refused to respect that they started to come in and enforce laws that were on the books but hadn't been enforced for decades. When they started to tax them in violation of their rights as Englishmen to have representation with their taxation. When they tried to try them in courts where they didn't have the rights of Englishmen to, jury by their peers. It was when Britain tried to treat them like colonies and less like vague associates of the empire that they rebelled. And the rebellion didn't come from the lower class or from the upper class. It came from the society as a whole. Now, in some of the colonies, there was more internal division. In much of the South, more oligarchic, you had a much higher preponderance of Tories. In Pennsylvania, a lot of ethnic minorities, they're scared of, potentially being abused by people like the Puritans. But in the mountain country, Appalachia, in Virginia, in New England, in places like that, you get this very great deal of social solidarity. Now, the governors, they've been appointed by the king, but it's going to be the colonial assemblies, the legislatures that run them out. People don't overthrow the colonial government. The colonial government declares independence, just like the states did in 1861, and they run the king's men out. It was the colonies asserting their unique identity that they'd always had. And as part of this, you're not going to get some kind of transformation of the basic structure. The structure, what we think of as America, had already been formed, and it had been formed by the nature of the colonies as voluntary settlements, by the necessity of them to compete with each other to attract immigrants, and by those churchmen who had led mass migrations of their people. Folks like those pilgrims that set out with the intention of creating a whole new society, something that's going to be based on principles instead of on some abstract tradition. And these colonies were, to my knowledge, the first such countries in the world. But the role of the founding fathers does matter. The way this is taught to you in grade school, they often emphasize like only the founding fathers, like they were just mega geniuses. Materialism, historical materialism, doesn't play as big a role. But the men who were in charge did matter, because that does still have an influence on the way that things shake out, on the way that things can go. One thing in particular that I think turned out to be very important was what I like to call the power of friendship. The founding fathers were friends with each other. Most of the famous ones that we think of were Virginia planters. They're all coming out of the same clique of plantation owners in the biggest of the colonies. And these guys are all personal friends with each other because their families are friends with each other. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Patrick Henry, they all live very close to each other. Jefferson and Madison are like right down the road from each other. And they didn't meet each other through the revolution or through politics. Their families had all been well established from the earliest days. In some sense, Virginia belonged to them. And these people also had a very great deal of solidarity, of consensus on the most important details of their ideology. They're going to disagree. You get a very different attitude towards governance from someone like Washington than you do from someone like Jefferson. And the Yankees are going to disagree a ton. Adams and Hamilton are kind of like way out there. They're scumbags, frankly. I could make a long form argument for that, but probably not a great use of your time. But the Virginians, they tend to have the same kind of open attitude towards religious freedom. They tend to have the same attitude that, classical republicanism, with a huge virtue, or with a huge focus on virtue and on independent landowners, is important. They're all very progressive for their era. And so this means that they have a great deal in common, both intellectually and in their personal lives. And so they're not going to guillotine each other like they do in France. If you ever read about the French Revolution, one of the things that strikes me about it is just how neurotic and nasty the revolutionaries come across as being. Now, don't get me wrong, they're still the good guys. And I feel like that's a somewhat controversial statement, but they really are. In France, they were taxing rich people less than they were poor people. That's reason enough to have guillotines. But with the French, they always come across as these nasty little schemers. It's like a bunch of mobsters who are just thinking of opportunities to bump each other off. For one, they don't come across as sincere about their professed values. With the founding fathers, it's totally different. They come across as, frankly, genuinely loving each other. I've made it a goal of mine to visit every presidential plantation that I can. I've done most of them. And one thing that always stands out to me is that when I'm in Virginia, the tour guides will be talking about how, oh yeah, James Madison used to come over to Thomas Jefferson's place all the time just to play checkers. They'd have like sleepovers as adult men. This one time, George Washington is having a conversation with Marquis de Lafayette, and he goes off to take a nap. And Washington invites Lafayette to like take a nap with him on the blanket. It's kind of weird, but Benjamin Franklin was on very good terms with all of them. They liked each other as people, and I think that played a very important role. if you need some economics jargon so that this feels like economics, there was a very positive network effect that came from these fellas knowing each other, from them all sharing this world together. But when you look at just about any other revolution, you don't see that. It's angry little political extremists looking to bump someone else off so that they can be the dictator. And there's one big fourth reason: God tier political philosophy. If ever there was a generation of men who truly lived up to the Aristotelian ideal of a philosopher king, it would have ironically been these Republicans. Benjamin Franklin is a legit scientist. He's one of the top electricity researchers of his day, up there with Volta. Thomas Jefferson has a huge interest. Well, he's a polymath. Often people call him the last polymath, a man who knew a little bit of everything, especially interested in natural sciences and architecture. James Madison spoke like 8 languages or something. These guys were very gifted at things besides politics, and I think that really did matter in that it made them more well-rounded as people, which perhaps made them better thinkers at politics. If you understand what I mean about being well-rounded, that even if one subject doesn't directly link to another, it does link to other ones. The more you know about the world in general, the better you understand individual parts of it. But one thing that truly set them apart was that they, or at least some of them, thought like economists. Because in contrast to utopian thinkers like your Frenchmen or your Russians, the Americans accounted for human nature in their designs. They understood that people are not machines and people are not angels. You can't expect people to do the right thing, and you can't just beat them with a stick to do whatever you want either. You have to think in terms of how people are going to react and how people are going to try to game the system. It was when I was at James Madison's plantation that I saw this video. They show it as part of their like introduction on him, and it stunned me. Well, I'll tell you why it stunned me after you watch it yourself.